Hi everybody, welcome back to Between the Lines. My name is Julian, I'm an obsessive reader and used book collector, and welcome to my review of Red Rising by Pierce Brown. This is a book that's been talked about pretty extensively on BookTube, so I'm not going to go on for hopefully too long about it, but I wanted to share some of my thoughts today, having finished the book sometime. I think last week I finished this. And like most of my reviews here on the channel, it's going to be spoiler free for the first part, so if you haven't read the book and are thinking about starting it, you're safe for the first part of this video, and I'll put up a tag when I get into the spoiler section. So if you don't care, or if you've read the book and want to hear my spoiler-filled thoughts, just stay tuned for later on. So Red Rising is a science fiction and sort of dystopian book written by Pierce Brown, and it's part of the Red Rising trilogy. And the world in which we find ourselves in this book is very similar to our own. In fact, it's supposed to take place in our future, in our solar system, although things are a little bit different than how they are now. And this world revolves around a sort of caste system that's based on color, where golds are the people who run everything and are at the top, and the other colors are designated into separate roles, all of them beneath gold, and going kind of in a hierarchy in which red is the lowest, and those are the miners, as in people who work in mines, not people under 18, and the people who kind of do the menial labor work part of this universe. And we focus around a young man named Darrow, who is a red, and he's a hell diver in one of the mining clans underneath the planet of Mars. Like a lot that happens in dystopian science fiction novels, they find themselves in their comfortable home situation, although the life of a red, and especially Darrow, is not comfortable at all. A lot of things happen, the outside world kind of intrudes on his life there, and of course he gets thrust into a greater story and learns a bit more about the wide world around him. And if you're familiar with this genre at all, or a lot of the stories that are kind of covered in the BookTube science fiction fantasy sphere, that's nothing new. But Red Rising has a lot more to offer than just its simple, straightforward, kind of structurally familiar tropes that it has, at least in the first part of the story. So the world of Red Rising, like I said earlier, is pretty familiar to us. It takes place in our solar system. One of my thoughts about this book was I wish that the world building was a bit more fleshed out. It was good, it was solid, all the pieces were there, and I thought it was interesting, but I was wanting a bit more allure and mystery to it, and maybe a bit more scope, although I think this is because I've been spoiled by the Wheel of Time, having read the first 4 books over the last few months, and the world building there is just, masterful and at the height of its genre. It's a pretty short book by the standards of sci-fi fantasy that I've been reading recently, so it got a lot done in the kind of page count it had, but maybe I was just wanting a little bit more and a little bit more extension into the greater story of what's going on in our solar system. But something I can commend this book for, and this is especially in the first act, kind of when we're with Darrow in the place where he lives, is that the book did a lot of good work in building empathy for our characters, especially Darrow. That's one of the most important things, especially with stories like this that rely more on the hero's journey setup and a more structurally kind of familiar course of events, is that establishing a lot of empathy up front is really going to get us on the side of the character, so when they go on this grand adventure, we're already on their side. It had some pretty emotionally wrenching scenes near the beginning that were done very effectively, so I thought that was a good way to get us on the side of Darrow and kind of his journey out and the motivations that he has throughout this entire book. And just like in many stories of this type, the world greatly expands after the first act of the story. There's a much bigger kind of world at play here. The stakes are way bigger than we thought they were in that initial act, and I thought the book handled that aspect of the greater world being a bit different than maybe we thought in a really cool way. And one thing that this book did really interesting was it had its story set up, it had its hero's journey beginning, but once it gets into its sort of main focus of plot in the second act and beyond in this book, it's very different from the beginning. Not to say it's tonally different or world different, it's just it focuses on a specific sort of plot that the first act wasn't necessarily setting up, and that's not a detractor or anything. I think this is where the book really shines. It's in this focused plot here. The first act was pretty fast paced, although I appreciated that it slowed down a bit for some of the scenes that really needed it. But once we get into the main drive of the story, it slows down a bit so we can take the time to really go with Darrow on this journey, and without giving anything away, kind of learning with Darrow and understanding the world around him and his place sort of within it. And this main aspect of the story here also pulls a lot from other kind of dystopian and YA stories like The Hunger Games, Harry Potter especially, and even things that are not YA like Lord of the Flies. There were a lot of elements from those three especially that I thought were really prevalent here. And in talking to my cousin about this, who is one of the people who recommended this book to me, really mentioned the similarities between this and Ender's Game, and I could definitely see a lot of those comparisons and maybe the inspirations it pulled. And this is the part of the story where I thought the themes and the ideas, which are so inherent to science fiction, kind of exploring ideas, ideologies, this is where it really shined for me, because it's so hard to talk about this without giving it away, kind of what happens in this part of the story, this main bulk of the story. But there's a lot of exploration here into the more militaristic, political, and ideological aspects of, being a leader, what kind of political systems work with different kinds of people, and sociological aspects. Like, all this stuff was being explored in a really interesting, compelling, thematic way. And I thought it was in a way that wasn't super ham-fisted or just explaining things to you. It was very organically tied to the plot, and I thought that was kind of really, really well done, giving you all these ideologies and explanations, but never making it in a way where it felt like I was in a classroom. And here in this main thrust of the story is where we meet some of the more interesting characters in this book, characters who I won't name until the spoiler part, but I feel like in the world that Darrow enters, there's just so many interesting people, good and bad and somewhere in between, and I can't wait to spend more time with them, hopefully in sequels. So overall, I liked this book. It was a lot of fun. It was pretty quick and very fast paced. If you like science fiction, militaristic sort of sci-fi, explorations of those kind of themes I talked about. If you like stuff like Ender's Game, I feel like you're gonna like this book. And if you like stuff like YA dystopian, The Hunger Games, Harry Potter, that sort of thing, I feel like you'll like it. But if you don't like those sort of dystopian YA setups where there's a disenfranchised teenager who kind of rises to the occasion and wants to change the world, then maybe don't get into this one. It leans very heavily into the hero's journey, but overall, I'd recommend this. All right, so that's it for my spoiler-free thoughts for Red Rising. I'm gonna get into spoilers now. So if you've read the book and want to hear my thoughts on, the details of this book, then stay along with me. But if you want to just skip to the end and get to my wrap up, I'm putting a time up on screen for you to do that. All right, so let's get into the spoilers. And the first thing I want to talk about is how there's a character named Julian and he immediately dies. What the f? Something I really enjoyed about this book was how they did something I always wish the Harry Potter books did, and was that it created empathetic and more dynamic and human people on, the bad guy's side. Harry Potter did that okay. There was a bit with Malfoy at the end, and Snape, of course, with his reveal. I still think that Snape is a and doesn't really deserve the praise he gets in retrospect for what he did in that series. But Red Rising does something that I always wish they did, in that characters like Mustang, Severo, and Roke, just so many people are so interesting and so compelling. They have flaws, they have emotion, wants, and needs. They have good aspects and sometimes bad aspects. All Slytherins are like, all of them, they're all either super racist or genocidal maniacs or bullies. Like, there's no in between. But here we get people on the Golds who are the bad guys, and even Darrow struggles through this. His whole goal is to get back at the Golds and fulfill Eo's dreams, and it's like, oh, these people are actually kind of, similar to me. They're just people. They're humans. Like, I think that sets up a really interesting conflict in a story where I wasn't necessarily expecting to have a balanced take on it, kind of like how Harry Potter did. And in talking about Eo's death, is it Eo or Ao? I don't know. I read the book, not the audiobook, so I don't know how it's pronounced. But this was something that both kind of really worked for me and didn't quite work for me. I really liked the way it was handled, in the sense that I liked how the pace slowed down and really let us kind of go through the moment-to-moment emotions of what Darrow was going through in her death. That was so heart-wrenching and was really, really powerful and well written, but I can't help but get a little annoyed at the kind of fridging trope that I've been seeing a lot of in fiction and reading, especially more of sci-fi and fantasy. I think this trope of kind of ritualistically sacrificing a loved one of the main character as a plot device didn't bother me as much until I watched the first season of the Wheel of Time show, where, spoilers for the first episode of that, they gave Perrin a completely random, not from the books, wife that died in the first episode to kind of spur him on his journey, which I thought was really dumb and clunky. And then seeing that again here, I was like, okay, I'm getting a little tired of this. But to be fair, Eo's death served a really, really interesting and thematic purpose for Darrow, and it wasn't just something thrown in to be like, oh no, he has a dead wife, I'm so sad. No, there was a specific and very directly tied to purpose for what Darrow goes through for the entirety of this book, and I can only imagine through the rest of the series. And in terms of the story, and talking about the story at large, I wish we spent a bit more time with that grander story, you know, the Sons of Ares stuff. We spent all that time getting Darrow set up as a member of their order and his planting in as a sort of red secret agent into the goals. I thought that was really interesting, but once it gets into the main thrust of the story in the Institute, I was like, okay, this is great, but what's going on outside of this? What's happening in the greater story here? And I wish maybe there was some more time after the end of the Institute and the game there to kind of wrap up that stuff and give a bit more as to where that's going. Although I think the end had a really interesting hook for the next book. So I'm excited to read the next one, but I wish we just got a bit more time being like, okay, what about the revolution here? What about the rebellion? What's going on there? We spent 80% of this book in this game. What the hell else is going on? And like I said in the spoiler-free section, I thought all the stuff about Darrow kind of learning how to become a leader and get people behind them and rallying them, and the divisions and different ideologies that people experience was so interesting and definitely my favorite aspect of this book. And although some things were a bit clunky and awkward and tropey earlier on, this is a book that made me really excited to read the next one. So that's it for my review of Red Rising by Pierce Brown. I liked the book overall. You know, it wasn't perfect, but what book is? And I've heard nothing but amazing things about book 2 from multiple people, so I'm super excited to get into that. I am taking a break. If you know me well, I've always talked about how I like taking breaks in between books in a series or else I'll get burnt out. So I'm going to read that one maybe sometime in June. So let me know in the comments if you liked Red Rising, if you read it, what your thoughts were, and if you were excited to read the next book. And if you haven't read it, will you read it based on my review or have my thoughts kind of pushed you away from it? So before you go, remember to do all the YouTube stuff like liking and subscribing. It always helps out and I really appreciate it. And as always, thank you for watching. Please remember to support your local library and I'll see you next time.